I was 19 years old when I heard those words for the first time. November 1943. We were aboard the USS Ashland, somewhere in the Pacific, and our company commander had just finished the final briefing for what they were calling Operation Galvanic. The target was a tiny speck of coral and sand called Betio, part of the Tarawa atoll in the Gilbert Islands. I remember standing there in that packed compartment, sweat already soaking through my utilities, even though we hadn't done anything yet, and listening to the intelligence officer read from a translated intercept. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, the Japanese commander on Betio, had sent a message to his superiors. The translation was rough, but the meaning was crystal clear. He said that 1 million men couldn't take Tarawa in 100 years. He called us weak, said the Americans didn't have the stomach for real combat, that we'd break and run the moment we faced determined resistance. I looked around at the other guys in my platoon. Most of them were kids like me, fresh out of boot camp at Paris Island or San Diego. A few were older, veterans of Guadalcanal who had that 1,000-yard stare even before the shooting started. Nobody laughed at Shibasaki's boast. We'd all heard about the fortifications, concrete bunkers, steel-reinforced pillboxes, coconut log barriers that could stop a tank. Thousands of Japanese Marines dug in so deep they might as well have been underground. My squad leader, Corporal Hansen, was a farm kid from Iowa who'd been at Guadalcanal. He leaned over and said something I'll never forget. He said the Japs on the canal fought hard, but they didn't have much in the way of prepared positions. Just jungle and whatever they could throw together. Tarawa was different. Tarawa was engineered, built to be a fortress. He said if the pre-invasion bombardment didn't do its job, we were going to pay for every yard of that island in blood. I didn't really understand what he meant at the time. I do now. The night before the landing, I couldn't sleep. None of us could. The ship was rolling in heavy swells, and you could hear guys puking in their heads every few minutes. I'd gone over my gear a dozen times. M1 Garand, 8 clips of ammunition in my cartridge belt, 2 fragmentation grenades, a canteen that was already half empty because I couldn't stop drinking, my K-bar knife, and a pack that weighed about 40 pounds with extra ammo, rations, and the entrenching tool. My rifle felt heavier than it had during training. Everything felt heavier. I kept thinking about what my father told me before I shipped out. He'd been in France during the First World War, and he said the waiting was always worse than the fighting. I didn't believe him then. I was eager, stupid, thought I knew what fear was. I didn't know anything. Around 0300, they started feeding us. Steak and eggs, which was supposed to be a treat, but nobody could keep it down. The galley smelled like grease and vomit. I forced down some coffee and a piece of bread, then went topside to get some air. The deck was crowded with Marines, all of us smoking, checking weapons, not saying much. You could see the outline of Betio in the distance, low and dark against the horizon. Then the naval bombardment started. I'd never heard anything like it. The battleships opened up first, their 16-inch guns sounding like the end of the world. Then the cruisers joined in, and the destroyers. The whole sky lit up orange and red. Shells were screaming overhead, and you could see the flashes when they hit the island. Columns of smoke and fire rising hundreds of feet into the air. It went on for hours. 3 hours of the most intense shelling I'd ever witnessed. Planes came in too, dropping bombs and strafing anything that moved. When it finally stopped, there was this eerie silence, just the sound of the ship's engines and the water. Someone near me said there was no way anything could have survived that. No way. The island must be nothing but rubble and corpses. I wanted to believe him. We all did. They loaded us into the Higgins boats around 0500. It was still dark, and the sea was rough. The boat coxswain was a Navy kid who didn't look much older than me, and his hands were shaking on the tiller. There were 36 of us crammed into that boat, rifles held high to keep them out of the spray. The boat rose and fell with the swells, and every time we dropped, my stomach went with it. I could hear guys praying, Hail Marys mostly. A few were singing hymns under their breath. Corporal Hansen just sat there with his eyes closed, breathing slow and steady. I asked him if he was scared. He opened his eyes and looked at me like I was an idiot. He said of course he was scared, that anyone who wasn't scared was either lying or crazy, and crazy men didn't last long in combat. Then he told me to check my rifle again, make sure the action was clear, because once we hit that beach there wouldn't be time to fix a jam. The run to the beach took longer than it should have. The boats were circling, waiting for the signal to go in. I could see other boats all around us, packed with Marines, and beyond them, the LVTs, the Amtraks that were supposed to carry the first waves all the way to shore. Those things could cross the reef that surrounded the island. Our Higgins boats couldn't. That was supposed to be okay, though, because intelligence said the tide would be high enough for us to get close. Intelligence was wrong. When the order came to head in, the coxswain gunned the engine and we started toward the beach. That's when I got my first good look at Batio in daylight. It was flat, barely above sea level, maybe 800 yards long, and 300 yards wide at its widest point. Coconut trees, or what was left of them after the bombardment. Smoke still rising from a few spots, but even from a distance, I could see the concrete structures, the bunkers, the pillboxes. They were still standing. The bombardment had kicked up a lot of sand and knocked down some trees, but those fortifications were intact. We were about 500 yards from shore when the first shells started landing. Japanese artillery. The boat next to us took a direct hit, just disappeared in a fountain of water and debris. I saw parts of bodies in the air, a helmet spinning end over end. Then we hit the reef. The boat ground to a halt with a sickening crunch, and the coxswain yelled that this was as far as he could go. The ramp dropped and Corporal Hansen went first, stepping off into water that was chest deep. He turned and yelled for us to move, to get off the boat now, and I followed him. The water was warm, warmer than I expected, and my pack immediately tried to drag me under. I got my footing on the coral and started moving, holding my rifle over my head. That's when the machine guns opened up. I'd heard machine gun fire before, on the range, but this was different. This wasn't aimed at targets. This was aimed at us. The water around me started boiling with bullets. I saw the guy in front of me, a kid from Brooklyn whose name I can't remember, just stop and fall forward. The water turned red around him. Someone behind me was screaming. I kept moving, trying to make myself smaller, hunching down even though the water was already up to my neck. The reef seemed to go on forever. Every step was agony, trying to move through water while carrying 40 pounds of gear and keeping your rifle dry. Bullets were snapping past my head, hitting the water with little puffs. Mortars were landing now too, big geysers of water and coral. I couldn't see the beach anymore, couldn't see anything but spray and smoke. My ears were ringing. I tripped over something in the water and went under, swallowed a mouthful of salt water and coral dust. When I came up, gasping, I saw what I'd tripped over. It was a Marine floating face down, his pack keeping him on the surface. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. If you stopped moving, you died. It took 20 minutes to cross that reef, 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours. By the time I reached the seawall, I was alone. I didn't know where Corporal Hansen was, didn't know where anyone from my boat was. The seawall was about 3 feet high, made of coconut logs, and there were already Marines pressed against it, returning fire. I threw myself down next to them, trying to catch my breath. My whole body was shaking. I looked back toward the reef and saw why we were stuck. The Higgins boats were stranded out there, hundreds of yards offshore, and Marines were in the water, trying to wade in under fire. The Amtraks that had made it to the beach were burning wrecks. Bodies were floating everywhere. The water was red for 50 yards out. A lieutenant I didn't recognize was screaming into a radio, calling for naval gunfire support, but I couldn't hear if anyone was answering. The noise was incredible. Machine guns, rifles, grenades, mortars, all of it blending together into one continuous roar. The air smelled like salt water and blood and burning fuel and something else, something sweet and rotten that I later learned was what death smells like when it's fresh. I checked my rifle. The action was clogged with sand and coral. I tried to clear it, hands shaking so bad I could barely work the bolt. A sergeant, I didn't know his name, came crawling along the seawall, checking positions. He saw my rifle and told me to field strip it right there, clean it fast, because we were going to assault that first pillbox in 5 minutes, and if my weapon didn't work, I was dead. I got the bolt out, wiped it down with a piece of cloth from my pack, reassembled it and worked the action. It felt smooth. I loaded a clip 8 rounds of 30-06 and waited. The assault was supposed to be coordinated. Bangalore torpedoes to blow gaps in the wire, then infantry to rush through while flamethrower teams hit the pillboxes. It didn't work out that way. The Bangalore team got cut down before they could place the charges. The flamethrower operator took a round through his fuel tank and went up like a torch, screaming. So we just went. The sergeant stood up and yelled for us to move, and we went over that seawall into hell. I don't remember making a conscious decision to stand up. My body just did it. Training maybe, or fear of being left behind. I ran toward the first pillbox, firing from the hip, not really aiming at anything. Marines were falling all around me. I saw a guy get hit in the face, saw his head snap back and his helmet fly off. Another guy made it 3 steps before a burst from a Nambu machine gun cut him in half. I dove behind a wrecked Amtrak and landed on someone. He was already dead, had been for a while from the look of him. I rolled off and tried to find a target. The pillbox was maybe 30 yards ahead, a concrete dome with a firing slit. Muzzle flashes were coming from that slit, steady and rhythmic. I aimed at the slit and fired. My round sparked off the concrete. I fired again. Same result. You couldn't hurt those things with rifle fire. The only thing that worked was getting close enough to throw a grenade through the slit, or getting a flamethrower team in range, or calling in a tank if we had any. We didn't have any. I heard someone yelling for a demo charge. A corporal with a satchel charge was sprinting toward the pillbox, weaving between bodies and debris. He made it to within 10 feet before he got hit. The satchel fell from his hands. I saw it lying there in the sand, maybe 15 feet from the pillbox. Without thinking, I got up and ran for it. Bullets were kicking up sand all around me. I grabbed the satchel, pulled the fuse and threw it at the firing slit. It bounced off the concrete and rolled to the base of the pillbox. I hit the ground and covered my head. The explosion was enormous. When I looked up, the pillbox was still standing, but the firing had stopped. Smoke was pouring out of the slit. We moved forward. The rest of that first day is a blur. We fought from one position to the next, sometimes gaining a few yards, sometimes getting pushed back. The Japanese didn't retreat. They didn't surrender. They fought from their bunkers until we killed them. And then we had to clear the bunkers room by room, throwing grenades into the dark and hoping we didn't hit a magazine that would blow us all up. I found Corporal Hansen around noon. He was alive, leading what was left of our platoon in an assault on a machine gun nest. He saw me and waved me over. He looked different, covered in sand and blood, most of it not his. His eyes were wild, but his voice was calm when he told me to take position on his left and cover his advance. We took that machine gun nest, cost us 4 men. The Japanese crew fought to the last man. One of them, wounded, tried to detonate a grenade when we got close. Corporal Hansen shot him before he could release the spoon. That night we dug in on the beach. There was no fresh water. The supplies that were supposed to come ashore were still on the reef, and nobody could get to them without getting killed. We shared canteens, a few sips each. Some guys were drinking from shell craters, even though the water was mixed with blood and God knows what else. I was too thirsty to care. I drank from a crater. It tasted like metal and death. I kept it down. The second day was worse. We'd gained maybe 200 yards of beach. There was still at least 400 yards to go, and every inch of it was covered by interlocking fields of fire from bunkers that our naval bombardment hadn't even scratched. The Marines who'd landed on the first day were exhausted, running low on ammo, and there were casualties everywhere. The corpsmen were overwhelmed. Wounded men were lying in the sun, calling for water, for morphine, for their mothers. I tried not to look at them, tried not to think about them. We got orders to attack at 0800. The objective was a complex of bunkers on the southern side of the airfield. Intelligence said it was lightly defended. Intelligence was wrong again. We moved out in a skirmish line, maybe 40 of us from what was left of the company. Corporal Hansen was carrying a bar now, a Browning automatic rifle he'd taken off a dead Marine. He said if we were going to die, he wanted to take as many of them with him as possible. The Japanese opened up when we were halfway across the open ground. It was a killing field. No cover, no concealment, just coral sand and scattered debris. Marines started dropping immediately. I saw men I'd trained with, guys I'd played cards with on the ship, cut down in seconds. I hit the ground and tried to make myself part of the sand. The bar next to me opened up, Corporal Hansen firing in controlled bursts, trying to suppress the bunkers. It wasn't enough. A mortar round landed close and I felt something hot slash across my leg. I looked down and saw blood soaking through my trousers. It didn't hurt yet. Shock, probably. A medic, a kid with glasses and a red cross on his helmet, crawled over and cut away my pant leg. He said I was lucky. It was just a fragment, and he poured sulfur powder on the wound and wrapped it with gauze. He told me to stay down, that I was going to be okay. Then he crawled to the next casualty and got shot in the back. He died right there, 5 feet from me. We pulled back. First time I'd ever seen Marines retreat, but there was no choice. The position was too strong, and we didn't have the firepower to take it. We left our dead, had to. There was no way to carry them back across that open ground without losing more men. I remember looking back and seeing them lying there, scattered across the sand like broken dolls. That night they brought in tanks, 3 M4 Shermans that had somehow made it across the reef. The next morning we tried again. This time the tanks led the way, and we followed in their wake, using them for cover. It worked better. The tanks could take hits that would kill a man, and their 75mm guns could crack open the bunkers. We fought all day, moving from bunker to bunker, pillbox to pillbox. The Japanese started using suicide tactics. Men with satchel charges strapped to their chests would run at the tanks, trying to blow themselves up underneath. The tank crews learned to keep their hatches closed and their machine guns firing. I saw one Japanese soldier, he couldn't have been more than 16, sprint toward our tank with a magnetic mine. The tank's bow gunner cut him down, but the kid's momentum carried him forward and he fell right in front of the treads. The tank ran over him. I heard the crunch. By the afternoon of the second day, we'd reached the airfield. It wasn't much, just a runway made of crushed coral, but it was the strategic objective, the reason we were there. Hold the airfield, and Tarawa became a base for bombing runs against the Marshall Islands. That's what they told us anyway. Right then, all I cared about was water and sleep and not getting killed. The third day, we went into the interior. That's when it got really bad. The bunkers there were bigger, more complex. Some of them were underground, connected by tunnels. You'd clear one room and think you were done. Then Japanese soldiers would pop up behind you from a tunnel entrance you didn't even know was there. We lost a lot of men to those tunnels. Corporal Hansen got hit on the third day. We were clearing a bunker complex near what the maps called the Burns-Philp Wharf. He was first through a door, and someone inside fired a burst from a knee mortar at point-blank range. The fragmentation hit him in the chest and neck. I got to him first, tried to stop the bleeding, but there was too much of it. He looked at me and tried to say something, but blood came out instead of words. He died in maybe 30 seconds. I'd known him for 3 months. He'd saved my life twice that I could count. I didn't have time to grieve. We had to keep moving. I picked up his bar and kept going. The bunker turned out to be a command post. There were maps on the walls, radio equipment, supplies, and bodies, Japanese officers mostly. They'd committed suicide rather than be captured. One of them was a rear admiral. He was sitting at a desk, a pistol in his hand, a bullet hole in his temple. There was a message on the desk written in Japanese. Someone who could read it translated later. It was from Rear Admiral Shibasaki to his superiors. He said the Americans had landed in force, that the defenses were holding, that his men would fight to the last round. He said he would not allow Tarawa to fall. But he knew it was going to. You could tell from the way the message was written. It wasn't a battle report, it was a farewell. We found Shibasaki's body the next morning. He'd been killed in the bombardment on the second day, they figured. His command bunker had taken a direct hit from a naval shell. The bunker had 16-inch thick walls of reinforced concrete, but that shell had punched through like it was cardboard. Shibasaki and his staff were just pieces. But even without their commander, the Japanese kept fighting. Every bunker had to be taken by force. Every pillbox had to be destroyed. We used flamethrowers, demolition charges, grenades, tank fire, whatever it took. The smell of burning flesh became so common that you stopped noticing it after a while. That's what scared me the most looking back. Not the fighting, not the fear, but the fact that I got used to it. I got used to stepping over bodies. I got used to the smell. I got used to killing. On the afternoon of the third day, November 23rd, organized resistance finally collapsed. We'd taken the whole island. The Marines who could still fight, we gathered near the airfield. There weren't many of us. Out of the 5,000 Marines who'd landed on the first day, over 1,000 were dead. Another 2,000 were wounded. I looked around at the survivors, these kids with 1,000-yard stares and hollow eyes, and I thought about what Shibasaki had said, that 1,000,000 men couldn't take Tarawa in 100 years, that we were weak. We'd proven him wrong, taken his fortress in 76 hours. But the cost, Jesus, the cost. They had us help with the cleanup. That was almost worse than the fighting. We went through the bunkers dragging out bodies, Japanese bodies mostly. There were thousands of them. Almost the entire garrison had been killed. Out of 4,500 Japanese troops, only 17 were captured, and most of those were Korean laborers who weren't really soldiers anyway. The Japanese Marines had fought to the last man. We found them in the bunkers, in the tunnels, in the pillboxes. Sometimes they'd fought so hard and so long in the heat that they'd cooked in their own bunkers. The smell was indescribable. We wore handkerchiefs over our faces, but it didn't help. That smell got into your clothes, your hair, your skin. I can still smell it sometimes, 70 years later. We buried our dead in a cemetery at one end of the island, neat rows of crosses, over 1,000 of them from those 3 days. I helped dig graves. The coral was hard, and it broke our shovels. We had to use explosives to blast holes deep enough. I remember standing there at one of the funeral services, listening to a chaplain read from the Bible, and thinking about Corporal Hansen, about the kid from Brooklyn, whose name I couldn't remember, about the medic with glasses, about all of them. The chaplain said they'd given their lives for their country, that their sacrifice meant something. I wanted to believe him. Some days I do. Some days I don't. They shipped us out about a week later, sent us to Hawaii for rest and refit. The whole trip back nobody talked much. We'd eat, sleep, sit on deck and stare at the ocean. I couldn't sleep without seeing the bodies in the water, hearing the screams. The Navy doctors called it combat fatigue, said it would get better with time. For some guys it did, for others it didn't. I was somewhere in the middle. I did 2 more amphibious assaults after Tarawa, Kwajalein and Saipan. Both were bad, but neither was as bad as Tarawa. Tarawa was where I learned what war really was. Not the movies, not the posters, not the speeches about duty and honor. Just men killing each other over a piece of coral in the middle of the ocean because someone with stars on their collar said it was strategically important. After the war, I went home, got married, had kids, lived a normal life, or as normal as you can when you've got Tarawa living in your head. I didn't talk about it for decades. What was there to say? Who would understand? Then in the 90s, they started having reunions. Tarawa survivors. I went to one. There were maybe 50 of us left by then, old men with canes and hearing aids. We sat around and told stories. And for the first time in 50 years, I didn't feel alone. These guys, they understood. They'd been there. They'd smelled the smell. They'd seen the things I'd seen. One guy, a former tank commander, he told me something that helped. He said we didn't go to Tarawa to prove Shibasaki wrong. We went because we were ordered to, and we fought because the guys next to us were fighting, and we survived because we were lucky. The Japanese garrison wasn't annihilated because we were strong. It was annihilated because war is hell, and somebody has to lose. That's all it was. Bad luck for them. Bad luck for us. Just bad luck all around. I think about Shibasaki's message sometimes. His boast that 1 million men couldn't take Tarawa in 100 years. He was wrong, but not in the way he thought. It didn't take 1 million men. It took 5,000 Marines, and it didn't take 100 years. It took 3 days. But here's the thing that haunts me. Shibasaki was right about one thing. We weren't weak, but we weren't strong either. We were just kids. 19-year-old kids with rifles and a job to do. And the job got done because enough of us were willing to walk through that water, across that reef into those machine guns, not because we were brave, not because we were heroes, because we didn't have a choice. You can call that strength if you want. I call it something else. I call it the price we paid for that strip of coral. 1,000 dead Marines, 2,000 wounded, an entire Japanese garrison wiped out. For what? So we could build an airfield. So we could move one island closer to Japan. So we could say we won. I wear my Tarawa pin on Veterans Day. I go to the reunions when I can. I tell the stories when people ask. But I never say we were strong. I say we were there. I say we did what we had to do. I say we survived. That's all any of us can say. The Japanese commander called us weak. 3 days later, his garrison was gone. But we were gone too, in a way. The kids who waded through that water, who climbed over that seawall, who fought through those bunkers, we didn't come back from Tarawa. We left parts of ourselves there. The parts that could sleep without nightmares, the parts that could see blood without flinching, The parts that remembered what peace felt like. I'm 93 years old now. Most of the guys I served with are gone. The tank commander who helped me understand, he died in 2008. The last time I saw him at a reunion in San Diego, he told me he still dreamed about Tarawa, still saw the Japanese soldier running at his tank with the mine, still heard the crunch of the treads. He said he'd made peace with it, but I could see in his eyes he was lying. You don't make peace with something like Tarawa. You just learn to live with it. That's what I've been doing for 70 years. Living with it. The memories are still there, sharp as broken coral, the smell of the burning Amtracs, the taste of that contaminated water, the sound of men screaming for corpsmen who couldn't get to them, the weight of Corporal Hansen's body when I tried to drag him to cover, the sight of that Japanese Admiral with a bullet in his head, sitting at his desk like he was just taking a nap, the rows and rows of crosses in the cemetery, all of it, still there, like it happened yesterday. My grandkids ask me about the war sometimes. They see the pictures, the medals, the old uniform I kept in the closet. They think it must have been exciting, an adventure. I tell them it wasn't like the movies. I tell them it was hot and loud and confusing and terrifying. I tell them we did what we had to do. I don't tell them about the bodies in the water. I don't tell them about the smell. I don't tell them how Corporal Hansen's blood looked black in the sun when it soaked into the sand. They're too young for that. Maybe everyone is. The thing about Tarawa is that it changed how the Marines did amphibious assaults. After the disaster of the first day, after watching hundreds of men get cut down in the water because the boats couldn't cross the reef, the Corps learned. They improved the intelligence. They built better landing craft. They developed new tactics. By the time we hit Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the lessons from Tarawa had been incorporated. Fewer men died crossing the reefs. The assaults were more coordinated. The naval gunfire support was more effective. So in that sense, maybe those 1,000 Marines didn't die for nothing. Maybe their sacrifice bought something for the guys who came after. That's what I tell myself anyway, when the nightmares get bad. But I don't really believe it. They died because war is random and brutal and indifferent to who deserves to live and who deserves to die. The medic with the glasses died, and I lived. Corporal Hansen died, and I lived. The kid from Brooklyn died, and I lived. Why, I don't know. Luck, timing, the angle of a bullet. Nothing meaningful. Nothing I can build a philosophy around. Just chaos and chance. The Japanese commander thought he could hold Tarawa. He was wrong. We thought we could take it without massive casualties. We were wrong. Everybody was wrong. Everybody paid. The only difference is we paid and won. They paid and lost. But when you're lying in a shell crater at night, listening to wounded men crying in the dark, wondering if the next mortar round has your name on it, it doesn't feel like winning. It just feels like surviving. And sometimes surviving is worse. Sometimes you wish you'd gone down in the water with the others. Sometimes you think about Corporal Hansen dying in 30 seconds while you're stuck with 70 years of remembering. I went back to Tarawa once. 1996. They organized a trip for survivors. I almost didn't go. My wife had to convince me. She said it might give me closure. I didn't tell her there's no such thing as closure for something like Tarawa, but I went anyway. The island looked different, smaller. There were people living there, Gilbertese natives who'd moved back after the war. The airfield was still there, crumbling but recognizable. The bunkers were still there too, concrete tombs scattered across the island, slowly being reclaimed by jungle. We visited the cemetery. The graves were well maintained, white crosses in perfect rows. I found the ones I knew, the medic, a couple guys from my squad. I couldn't find Corporal Hansen's. I asked a guide and he checked the records. Turns out Hansen's body had been repatriated in the 50s, sent home to Iowa. His family wanted him buried there. I was glad. He deserved better than a coral island in the middle of nowhere. We walked the beach where we'd landed. It was quiet, peaceful. Kids were playing in the surf. The water was clear and blue, and you couldn't tell that 70 years ago it had been red with blood. The seawall was gone, eroded away by time and tide. The wrecked Amtracs were gone too, salvaged for scrap. All the evidence of the battle had been cleaned up or buried or washed away. But I could still see it. Every step I took, I saw ghosts. Marines in the water struggling toward shore, bodies floating face down. The pillbox that killed so many of us. The command bunker where we found Shibasaki's message. It was all still there, overlaid on the peaceful tropical paradise like a double-exposure photograph. One of the other veterans, a guy who'd been a machine gunner in the third wave, he broke down on that beach, started crying, couldn't stop. His son had to help him back to the bus. I understood. Sometimes going back doesn't give you closure. Sometimes it just tears open the old wounds. The last thing we did on that trip was attend a ceremony. The Gilbert's government had erected a monument to both sides, American and Japanese, all the men who died fighting for that island. There were speeches about sacrifice and reconciliation, about how the war was long over, how we needed to remember but also to forgive. The Japanese ambassador spoke about the courage of Rear Admiral Shibasaki and his garrison. The American ambassador spoke about the bravery of the Marines. Everybody shook hands. Everybody smiled for the cameras. I stood there in the heat, sweating through my shirt, and I thought about what Shibasaki had said, that we were weak, that 1,000,000 men couldn't take Tarawa in 100 years. And I thought about the answer we'd given him, not with words but with blood. 5,000 Marines, 76 hours, total annihilation of his garrison. That was our answer. But standing there at that monument, looking at the list of names carved into stone, American and Japanese side by side, all of them dead, I realized something. Shibasaki wasn't the enemy. The war was. The decision-makers who sent us there, who sent them there, who turned a peaceful atoll into a slaughterhouse, they were the enemy. The Japanese kids in those bunkers, they were just following orders, same as us. They died because they were told to hold Tarawa. We died because we were told to take it. And in the end, what did it matter? The war ended. Japan surrendered. Tarawa became a footnote. The people who made the decisions, they got to go home and write memoirs and give speeches. The people who paid for those decisions, we got 70 years of nightmares and a medal we keep in a drawer. That's the real story of Tarawa. Not the heroism, not the sacrifice, just the cost. The unbearable, unpayable cost of 3 days in hell. I don't know how much longer I have. The doctors say my heart's giving out. Too many years, too much stress. Maybe it's the weight of carrying Tarawa around. Maybe your heart can only take so much before it breaks. I've made my peace with dying. I'm not afraid of it. What I'm afraid of is being forgotten. Not me, specifically. I don't care about that. But the guys who didn't make it off that island. The 1,000 Marines whose lives ended before they really began. The medic with the glasses. The kid from Brooklyn. Corporal Hansen. All of them. I'm afraid that in another 50 years, nobody will remember Tarawa. It'll just be another name in a history book. 3 days of fighting that happened a long time ago in a war that everybody's moved past. The Japanese commander will be a trivia question, will be statistics. And all that pain, all that fear, all that death, it won't mean anything. That's why I'm telling you this. Because somebody needs to know what happened there. Not the official version, not the sanitized story they tell at the memorials. The real story. The one about kids who were scared and tired and just wanted to go home. The one about how we waded through water filled with our dead friends. The one about how we killed and killed and killed until there was nobody left to kill. The one about how we proved a Japanese admiral wrong, but the price was so high that the victory felt hollow. That's the story of Tarawa. And if you remember nothing else, remember this. War isn't glorious. It isn't noble. It's just young men dying for old men's decisions. The Japanese commander called us weak. We showed him he was wrong. But in doing so, we showed ourselves something too. We showed ourselves what we were capable of, the things we could do when we were pushed far enough. And that knowledge, that understanding of what human beings will do to each other when nations go to war, that's the real legacy of Tarawa. Not the airfield we built, not the strategic victory we won. Just the knowledge that we're all capable of horror when we're given the right orders and the right circumstances. The Japanese garrison was annihilated, but something in us was annihilated too. The part that believed war was anything other than organized murder. The part that thought there were winners in combat. The part that still believed in innocence. We left all of that on Betio Island, sinking into the coral sand along with the blood of 1,000 Marines and 4,000 Japanese soldiers. And 70 years later, I'm still there. Still wading through that water, still hearing those screams, still seeing Corporal Hansen's face as he died. They gave me a bronze star for valor, said I showed exceptional courage under fire. I keep it in a drawer with my other medals. I never wear it, because I don't feel like I did anything exceptional. I just survived when others didn't. And every day since, I've wondered why. Why me? Why did I get to come home when so many others didn't? There's no answer, there never will be. That's Tarawa, that's war. Just questions without answers and wounds that never heal, and the ghost of a Japanese admiral who thought we were weak. He was wrong. But God, I wish he'd been right.